Franz Kafka. Why should we read Franz Kafka? I take the answer from Kafka's own writings. In a letter he wrote to his sister, his favorite sister, Ottilie, he wrote this: "If the book we read doesn't wake us up like a blow on the head, what are we reading it for? We need the books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we love more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us." And I hope Kafka will be that book, that axe, that awakes something inside you. Kafka is a visionary. Kafka is a visionary. He's highly influential, he's highly studied, he's highly reflected upon. And remember the first question I asked about how can we bring together the 20th century? And of course, there are many great figures that bring together the 20th century. And I told you to reflect about it. And remember the ambivalence of this word. To reflect means either to mirror something or to ponder about something. So when you approach Kafka, ask yourselves, how does he reflect about the 20th century? How does he reflect about his surroundings? How does he reflect about his context? World War I, for example. He didn't live to see World War II. And maybe he should be grateful for that. But how he reflects about his context. We are way into modernity. So Kafka's reflections are worth listening to. In addition, you can also ask yourselves how he mirrors the 20th century. How does he reflect the 20th century? And I think he reflects it quite well. I've prepared this lecture with studies, of course, Kafka's works. I've watched also some conferences. And one of the things that strikes me the most, for example, just yesterday, I was watching a conference by Antonio Lastra. It's on YouTube. You can find it. It's called Madriguera de Kafka. It's in Spanish. It's impressive how this man, who has devoted 30 years of his life to the study of Kafka, is not satisfied. And he's convinced there's way more for him to learn and to draw from Kafka, to the point that he says the peril of reading Kafka is that once you read him, you'll not want to read anything else. Kafka is a pessimist. And that's clear. Anyone can see it from miles afar. That's why I think it's also a very good exercise for us as we train ourselves in the art of listening. Instead of just blocking him or approaching him with prejudices, let's listen to him. Over the course of your lives, you'll find a wide range of people. Maybe some of them are going to be pessimists. Because there are pessimists, are you going to ban them? Are you going to banish them? Are you going to block them? Or are you going to listen to them? First question. So let's try to approach Kafka and let's try to get to listen to him. When we come close to Kafka, an image, an allegory, an analogy, a metaphor I could use is that of approaching a work of contemporary art, especially that of abstract expressionism. It's not clear. It's not always clear. And above all, it doesn't have one interpretation. It lends itself to multiple interpretations. When you look at a work by Leonardo da Vinci or by Raffaello, I see that as a lecture. So he's depicting something, and you get what the author tried to transmit. Of course, there might be some room for your own personal interpretation, but it's way more limited than when you approach Jackson Pollock, for example, or Kandinsky, or Rothko. There, the input of the viewer is way more significant, and it speaks eloquently about yourself because you see yourself reflected in some way. I know you like philosophy, so the principle quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur, whatever is received according to the mold in which it's received. So maybe the way you receive Kafka is going to tell you a lot about yourself. There's not one interpretation of Kafka. Kafka has been read from an anti-communistic perspective, from a feministic perspective, from a psychoanalytic perspective. He's been seen, his writings have been seen as a reflection on Judaism, existentialism, bureaucracy in the cities. Recently, when we visited the Holy Apostles, the theology professor over there, he said that Kafka reminded him of bureaucracy within the church. So there's a wide range of interpretations when we approach Kafka. Now, let me push it forward and let me stress the question. Okay, I'm gonna press this question a little more. Is Kafka worth reading for anything else other than the exercise of sympathizing and listening to him? You can say it's worth reading, reading Kafka is worth reading only for that, okay? And if that's what you draw from Kafka, I think you are getting a lot. However, I think there's way more for us to receive from Kafka. It's not only an artificial exercise of being condescending and saying, poor you. It's not a mere artificial exercise of empathizing and saying, oh, you had a troubled life and that's why you wrote such troubled themes. It's way more than that. And that is why I want to dedicate this session to stressing, to highlighting, to emphasizing the value of Kafka. The value of Kafka in himself. Kafka was born on the 3rd of July, 1883. I'm not gonna delve extensively in his biography because that's something you can easily get from any source, even Wikipedia, okay? And it's quite complete. And he died on the 3rd of June in 1924. Just a month short from his 41st birthday. He was born in Prague, today the capital of the Czech Republic. Back then, it belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born to a German-speaking family, a Jewish German-speaking family. So that from the outset sets one of the main themes of Kafka. Alienation, meaning I feel as a foreigner. I don't feel I belong, even within my own family, even within my own country. Kafka was fluent in German. He spoke German fluently. He wrote all of his works in German, but he spoke German with a Czech accent. And while some say that he was perfectly fluent in Czech, he had a job in Prague, so I think he was perfectly fluent. He himself didn't consider he was fluent in Czech, so he didn't even have a language to relate to. The sense of alienation. He was the eldest of 6 children. His father was a self-made businessman. In one of his letters to his father, he said, "All my writings are about you." And that was not a compliment, because he felt overwhelmed by an overbearing presence. Kafka was sickly. That doesn't mean he was weak, because he stood like 6 feet tall. Okay, and his father was also very big. But Kafka was thin. Instead, his father was big. And that created a contrast, and Kafka felt overwhelmed by his father. And you can see that in the judgment that you have in the anthology. The presence of the father, that is very autobiographical, and we'll get there soon. He studied at German school within Prague. Then he applied for the university, and he studied law. It's important to notice also that it is in the university where he encountered his friend for the rest of his life, Max Brod. And he's very important. You have Max Brod written there. He's very important because it is thanks to him that we have Kafka. Kafka would have wanted all of his works destroyed. But Max Brod preserved them, edited them. Then we can speak about how he edited them and how accurate his editions were. But the point is, he edited them to make them maybe a little more readable and had them published. So we owe a lot to Max Brod. Describing his time in the university, Kafka describes himself in conflict with an absurd universe. Let me read you this quote. "Enclosed in my own four walls, I found myself as an immigrant imprisoned in a foreign country. I saw my family as strange aliens whose foreign customs, rights, and very language defied comprehension. Though I did not want it, they forced me to participate in their bizarre rituals. I could not resist." Maybe he's speaking about religious rituals because his family was a Jewish family, and Kafka didn't participate in those rituals, and he was not a fervent Jew. He declared himself an atheist, although he did find some kind of beauty in the Yiddish liturgy. But in Kafka we find someone who doesn't fit in. And that's one of his main struggles. After he completed his law studies, he started working for a lawyer firm. It was an insurance company in 1907. We see that many writers that we have looked at during our literature course studied law and did it poorly and didn't finish. Instead, Kafka did remarkably well. He was a very efficient worker, and that made his ascent within the corporation meteoric. He was ascended, he was promoted because he was a very good worker. He was very effective. He was working from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., which doesn't mean that didn't bring him a lot of distress, because he needed his writing and his reading. But let's focus now on his writing. So sometimes he dedicated his night, his sleep time, to writing. In 1912, he met Felice Brod. The two letters FB will re-echo with what you find in Das Urteil, the judgment. Frida Brandenfelde. So you can see how it is autobiographical. He fell in love with her. Although they corresponded mostly through letters, and they were engaged twice, but Kafka never got married. He was engaged several times, but he never married. After he met Felice Brod, he wrote the judgment in a single night. So it's not uncommon for Kafka to write during the night. What is remarkable is that he completed the whole work in a single night. Some say it's the most autobiographical of his writings. there are many autobiographical writings, beginning with his diary, right? Or his character who is Joseph K, or a simple K, or even Gregor Samsa from the Metamorphoses. He is also his name, Gregor Samsa, it has the same number of syllables and letters as Franz Kafka. So there are many autobiographical characters in Kafka's writings, but definitely Das Urteil is one of the most autobiographical characters, in which that tension between his own life dedicated to his art as a writer, and the tension dedicated to, let's call it a common career, where he ascends in the lawyer's firm, he gets married, and he has a normal life. That was a tension for him, because for him his art demanded some form of consecration. And you can see that tension in The Judgment, where the protagonist is struggling between his engagement and a life dedicated to his art, like that of his friend who lived in Russia. All that overwhelmed by the figure of his father. In 1915, he was drafted for World War I, but his insurance company managed to keep him, because ultimately that was a business for war. That insurance company was not only for accidents during work, which did happen, but it was also for the injuries and the soldiers who had been injured during war. And Kafka was incredibly effective in his work. When he wrote a report of what had happened during the accident, it was literally beautiful and uncontestable, because he was very minute and he went to all the single details, and his supervisors hardly ever had to change or add anything to what he had written. He was incredibly effective in his work. 1920, he met Julie Vorisek. She was a poor chambermaid. That same year, he began an intense relationship with Milena Jesenska, who was a Czech journalist. Again, they didn't marry. Then his last love was Dora Diamant, but that didn't work either. For Kafka, his art required some form of consecration, and he needed that. He was already diagnosed with tuberculosis, and in 1924, his health quickly declined. His sister Ottilie took care of him, and his last request to Max Brod was to have all of his writings burned. I don't know how sincere that request was, because he knew nobody appreciated his writings more than Max Brod. If he had wanted them burned, maybe he should have given them to his sister Ottilie or to his own father. So I don't know how sincere, or at least how accurate, how well targeted that request was. But as you know, Max Brod not only didn't burn his writings, but he edited them and had them published. His last writing was a letter to his parents. There's another letter to his father, which his father never read because his mother intercepted it, but that's a strong writing. But his last writing ever was a letter to his parents. He also, during this time, he was also editing A Hunger Artist, which you also have in your anthologies. And he was infected with tuberculosis, but he starved to death. He didn't die from tuberculosis. He couldn't eat, so he starved. He starved, and while he was starving, he edited and he made the final adjustments to The Hunger Artist. He himself burned, it's estimated maybe like 90% of his writings. So what survives is what he didn't get to burn. In addition, the Gestapo confiscated some of his papers. So even today, scholars are still hoping they'll find a briefcase or a notebook that had been confiscated where we can find more of Kafka's writings. He was incredibly influential. For example, it's him who helped Garcia Marquez discover his own literary vocation, realizing that there's not one mold to write, so that we can write in different ways. He was highly criticized by Hitler and Nazism for being a Jew, and his books were forbidden in Nazi Germany. His books were also forbidden in the Soviet Union because they were not realistic enough. His books were also in the index of forbidden books for the Catholic Church. He was very influential in Borges. Some say he translated the Metamorphoses and some of his stories. Then someone contested that claim and said that Borges had not translated it. And then Borges himself, said he had not translated it. And then he said I don't know. But Borges had a lot to do with the works of Kafka, and he was very influenced by it. You can see that in the very name fictions of his book re-echoes Kafka, because we owe science fiction to Kafka. Science fiction as a genre, we owe it to Kafka to a significant extent. He was also very influential in Camus and Sartre. I still have a few minutes. Have you heard the adjective Kafkaesque? Kafkiano. It's in the dictionary, and it means something dark, something gloomy, something overbearing, something labyrinthic. To begin with, he's not always that. He has one or two, maybe not many, but he has one or two happy ending stories. One of them being America. He never visited America. He never read an American author. But he understood quite well the American dream, and the protagonist in his novel, America, comes to the States, leaving behind the tradition and the inheritance and the burden of Europe. And he dedicates himself to what you have, I think, in the Declaration of Independence, right? What is that? The pursuit of happiness. He praised America because they were grounded, and their founding fathers looked for the ideal of the pursuit of happiness. So he's not always like that. There are some happy ending stories. But for the most, you will say, yes, he's Kafkaesque. Meaning he's dark, he's gloomy, he's overbearing, he's labyrinthic. However, first question, are we taking Kafka too seriously? What if this is dark comedy? Kafka used to read his own writings and he laughed. His friend Max Brod describes him as amusing, and he was often joking. So try to read The Hunger Artist as a comedy. And it fits. It's a dark comedy, and it's the sense of irony in his life. It's like a tragicomedy. Nevertheless, I don't think that's the end of the story. If Kafka was amusing, and if Kafka made laugh his listeners, and he himself was laughing around when he was reading his own works, I think that was, above all, a coping mechanism. I think that was a coping mechanism. However, what's the value of Kafka? To begin with, he is true to himself. Mario Vargas Llosa said of Kafka, if Kafka had dedicated himself to writing literary criticism, to writing social criticism, he would have been a horrendous social critic. He was true to his literary vocation. And in that way, he brings up a profound social criticism way more than you often find in social critics. He does it through the vehicle of literature. In Kafka, we also find the value of art. Writing and reading, dedicating one's life to some quest of transcendence. As an atheist, he didn't have any other sense of transcendence other than that of beauty. Because even his failure is beautifully told. He can describe grotesque situations, but he doesn't describe them in a grotesque way. His prose is very clear. It's very transparent. It's very easy to read. He envisioned his writing as a need, like the fresh air he needed. He even said his writing was for him like a form of prayer, because it is there where he found transcendence. Another merit of Kafka, and I think another value of Kafka, is that he removes our rose-tinted lenses. We can face reality as it is, removing our rose-tinted glasses. Do you see it? I'm running out of time, but I think it's worth highlighting this anecdote. Georg Lukács. Is there such thing as Marxist art? Marx was very contrary to art because it belonged to the bourgeoisie, right? But the Hungarian Minister of Culture for the Soviet Union, Georg Lukács, he started writing and developing a theory of Marxist art. Art can be framed within Marxism in as much as it's a revolutionary art, in as much as it pushes the revolution, in as much as it promotes communism. Now, as you know, Kafka was banned within the Soviet Union because he was not realistic enough. One night, Georg Lukács was walking in some street of Budapest, and a van stops and they pull him in. He thought this was the end. And all the way in the van, he said to himself, Kafka war ein Realist. Kafka war ein Realist. Kafka was a realist. Think of the process. It is then when he realizes how crude reality can be. So Kafka depicts reality in a very profound way. He's a pessimist, but he's not a defeatist. He would very gladly accept the title of a pessimist, just like Schopenhauer or Leopardi, but he never gives up. His characters never give up in that quest of meaning, to the point that it's worth investing one's own life in the quest of meaning. His protagonist is always the individual, not the bureaucratic system. And while I've said he was an atheist, let me finish with this quote from his Zurau. At the end of his life, he may have opened himself to some form of transcendence. And I'll finish with this quote. Man cannot live without a trust in something indestructible within himself, though both that indestructible something and his own trust in it may remain permanently concealed from him. Thank you very much.